Hi, this is Tim Weber from South Texas College coming to you with another lecture video to round out the topic of late adulthood in terms of social development and a couple other related topics. So here we go. There we are. Okay. And let me get rid of my face. There we go. Okay, so in looking at this, we'll be looking at social development in terms of relationships, couple relationships, family relationships, and then relationships with friends. We'll then have a look at the frail elderly. How do we identify them, as well as their care, and then the topic of elder abuse. So, first of all, in terms of relationships, one of the things that we see very frequently in late adulthood is long-term marriages or long-term intimate relationships, if not marriages. And we'll just kind of lump those together, talking about them in terms of marriages, but it may be an intimate partner that one was not married to. So, having a spouse as one gets into late adulthood seems to be very beneficial, seems to buffer against many of the problems of aging, seems to extend life as well. So it seems to be a distinct advantage to go into late adulthood with a long-term partner. They've also noted that people report higher levels of personal happiness with longer and higher quality marriages or intimate relationships. So, the longer people have these relationships, the more happiness they report, and also the better the quality, again, the greater personal happiness reported in general. So again, seems to have a lot to do also with the emotional quality people experience in late adulthood. Now, why do also many older adults report that their marriages or intimate relationships are now better than they ever were before? Here's some reasons. For one thing, their children are generally grown and out on their own, so the stresses of raising children are now a thing of the past. They have a predictable, although not necessarily exciting income, but at least they sort of know what's coming in. And they have a great deal of familiarity with one another. And so that means that they have long before this divided tasks, so there's no arguments about who's taking out the trash. They simply do those tasks. They've also had a lot of experiences with one another, valued experiences that they can remember. And they've also developed by this time a greater sense of acceptance, mutual respect. So things that might have bothered them about their spouse or partner when they were younger, now they've learned to accept those things and just say, hey, that's just the way they are, and that's it. So all of this leads to people generally reporting better quality relationships at this point. Now, losing a spouse or again, intimate partner is also something that when it occurs, most commonly occurs in late adulthood. So, in fact, it is quite common as people get into late adulthood experiences. Um, this presents numerous difficult challenges and seems to be particularly challenging in the first couple years after losing that partner. Now, here's a kind of a weird statistic. On average, women spend between 4 and 10 years as widows, although the average man, none. And you say, well, that doesn't make sense. But if you think about it a little more deeply, here's some of the reasons why. Okay. For one thing, men on average live fewer years than women. Women tend to live longer. Okay, so women are more likely to become a widow than the man, who's more likely to die earlier. Also, in many relationships, the man is also older than the woman. And so you put that together, yeah, the man is likely to die sooner than the woman in that relationship. Um, and also add to that, in fact, that um, now let's just leave it at that. Um, okay, so for women, one of the things that they may experience the death of their husband. This may reduce their status in terms of, a lot of people may think of them in relationship to their husband. Oh, your husband is Doctor So and so, things like that. Income as well, and so some loss of income is common at that point. Also, identity. So, if their identity is tied up as being the husband or wife of that person, then that's going to require some change in identity if that person is no longer living. Um, Widows cope with this, women who lose their spouse cope with this often by spending more time with friends and family and turning to those relationships. Now, on the other hand, who suffers more generally when losing a spouse? It's usually the male partner that does. So, widowers, one of the reasons that they suffer more is they tend not to seek help in coping with that. They tend to keep to themselves about it, try to handle it on their own without support from others. And men also tend to have fewer friends, even in late adulthood. And often they don't receive as much comfort and attention from the family as when female elderly person passes away. And they kind of think, yeah, daddy's tough. He'll make it. He'll be fine. When in fact he may be suffering significantly. Males also tend to suffer more because, yeah, a lot of times they've kind of relied on their wives to perform basic household tasks for them, cooking, cleaning, stuff like that. They've relied on that, and they've relied on them for companionship, emotional support. Again, often men don't have a strong support network outside of just their spouse for these things. And so that can mean they've lost something very significant. And so what we find, particularly amongst men, risk of suicide and illness increases significantly in the first year after losing a spouse, diminishing somewhat after that, but still being higher. Um, Also, what we're going to see is that men are more likely to remarry after losing a spouse than women. And you can say part of it is because, yeah, it's harder on them. Um, yeah. So, losing a spouse, especially for males, is tough, but very tough for women too. But, given that it's more difficult for males, I've told my wife that, hey, you know what? You're not allowed to die before me because I don't think I'll do very well without her. But, that's kind of the way it goes. But either males or females, it is a very difficult change in their life. Now, in terms of relationships with the rest of their family, then older adults often stay in touch with younger generations of the family, often visiting with them frequently if they're nearby, or keeping in touch with them through the phone or even social media today if they're distant. And interestingly, today, the older adult may experience two or more generations of younger family members. So it's common now for that older adult to have a grown up child, as well as grandchildren, and even quite frequently great grandchildren. Previous generations often didn't have that because people didn't live as long, didn't live long enough to experience this in many cases. But this whole thing has also led to something they call the beanpole family. And I always thought, well, what was that? Everybody's real skinny, like one of those bowl beans poles that they use to hold up beans in a vegetable garden. What this is the family tree is tall and thin. In other words, there may be now several generations, but because adults are having fewer children, there's fewer people in each generation now. So resulting in a taller but thinner family tree. And so what that means is, yeah, nowadays many children may have no aunts, uncles, cousins, brothers, or sisters, that sort of thing. But this also is significant for the older adult because having few members of each generation, if they need assistance, there may be fewer people now available, the younger generations of their family available to help them out. So, relationships between that elderly person and their adult children. Usually, there continues to be engagement and interaction between them. Although, interestingly, the relationship between mother and daughter tends to be more vulnerable to conflicts, just as it is throughout the whole lifespan, actually. So where there is friction, it tends to be more that than uh, the male and their sons or daughters. We also see on the part of adult children filial responsibility. So this is taking responsibility for the well-being of an older parent. Um, these intergenerational relationships affected by a lot of factors. So whether that younger adult child steps in to help an older elderly parent is influenced by, first of all, is there a need? As well as, is that adult child capable of providing what's needed? Also, geographical proximity. Yes, if that older adult is close enough by, that adult child may be able to help. If they're further away, they may not be able to directly contribute. Also, the history of that relationship. If it was one of love and respect, that adult child is more likely to step in to help when needed. If it's one where there's been a broken relationship, hasn't been repaired, then it becomes less likely. Now, when they interviewed sons and daughters, adult children of elderly, about why they would help their aging parents, it's interesting that the motivations differed gender wise. Sons tended to say, well, I would do so because, well, it's my duty to do it. They tended to say that. Daughters tended to say it was more because, well, I love them because of their strong affection that they would have. So it seems that we differ a little bit in our motivations on average. Now, interestingly, assistance actually is more likely to flow from the elderly to their adult children than it is from adult children to the elderly person. So it's still flowing from older to younger, even at that point, more commonly than the other way around. We also then have the potential of grandchildren for the elderly, or now, it might even be uh, in terms of late middle adulthood. When we see this, we see three basic patterns of grandparenting that are common. And so we see some grandparents that they refer to as sort of remote grandparents. So they may be geographically far away from their grandchildren, or they may be emotionally distant. These would be the grandparents that maybe the child is taught that, you have to treat them with utmost respect. And so you don't play with them, you don't speak to them unless they speak to you first, and so on. The grandparent that's sort of put up on the pedestal. So there's also the involved grandparent style. This particular type of grandparent is one that may be involved with the grandchild every day or almost every day. a regular basis. They may actually be taking responsibility to help raise the child, like maybe help watching them after school, things like that. So that's those grandparents that are involved all the time. Then we also have what they call the companionate style of grandparent. This is the kind of grandparent that they are not involved with the child on an everyday basis, but they interact with them, they come and visit with them. And these are the type of grandparents that come and play with the child, and then they go on their way and say, "That's it, I'm done." You know, so they're not taking particular responsibility. These are the grandparents, and they like to see themselves as sort of the playmate or friend of the child. And so there's very different styles of grandparenting. And as you think about your grandparents, you might think about what approach did they represent most. It's also possible that some grandparents end up becoming surrogate parents. In other words, when their adult child is unable to fulfill their role as parent, then that grandparent may have to step in and take over raising the child. You think of situations where maybe the adult child has died, or maybe has a significant problem like ends up in prison, or has a terrible drug abuse or alcohol problem and so forth. That's where that grandparent may feel the need to step in and raise that grandchild. Now, it's interesting, when they interviewed grandparents who were functioning as surrogate parents, they sort of had mixed views on it. It seemed that often they would say, well, it's a little bit more difficult than it was raising my children originally. Obviously, when you're a bit older, it's a little harder to keep up with children and so forth. So it's kind of a little more stressful for them. On the other hand, they would often say, in spite of it being stressful and thinking that, hey, I'm done raising children and here I am again doing it, they often said, in spite of all that, I really feel satisfaction that I'm really doing something beneficial in the world and worthwhile in helping that child grow up well. Mixed feelings often about that. Okay, what about friendships in the elderly? Well, you might be surprised to learn how important this is for them. They actually found that life satisfaction in the elderly correlated more closely with their friendships than their contact with younger relatives. So, really important to them. And that said, it seems to be the quality of their friendships that is most important to them rather than the quantity. So it didn't matter so much how many friends they had, but did they have friends that they felt close with, that they could confide in? And what they found is older adults that had at least one confidant, close friend that you could just talk about anything with, that acted as a buffer against many forms of difficulty that come along in old age, loss of status, poor health, companionship. You just had one close friend, often that enabled that person to cope with it more readily. So, one of the things that then is possible for some um, people in late adulthood would be realizing retirement. So when that occurs, often the person is anticipating that they're not going to have to go to work anymore and the stresses of work are going to be over. But they find that actually adjusting to retirement may be more difficult than they expected. In fact, they have to make real adjustments in terms of their pattern of activity and what they're going to do with all this leisure time that they now have. And so think about it. When people are working, this provides for many needs that they might not have thought of. They might have thought of it just as, well, I'm making money. But in fact, as people are working, they actually have an opportunity to interact with others, so social interaction and relationships. They also, it gives them a sense that they're doing something productive. It gives them a chance to keep up on things beyond just what's going on at home. And it gives them structure to their life, that you do such and such at this time. You get up and go to work, and then you take a break, and you know that sort of thing. And so when they retire, all of a sudden, yeah, now you don't have all those people around you. You're here at home with no structure and all this time on your hands. Maybe you got your spouse there, and you look at them and you say, "Oh, who are you? Oh, I remember you," you know. But it can be a real shock to older people. And so that said, given a little time, even if people have some initial difficulty, they begin actually then figuring out how they're going to structure their time, developing ways to stay in touch with other people, and to get a sense of productivity even while they're not working. So it may take some time for people, though. One of the things that older people also might prefer in terms of where they live is aging in place, what they call it. So they often prefer to continue living in the same home, the same community that they've had for many years. And so what you also may see is sort of naturally occurring retirement communities. You might see certain areas of town or certain blocks where people moved into those homes when they were having their families at first. And so those young families grew up there together, and then the parents stayed there. And so now you have everybody in the neighborhood, elderly people, been there many years. Now, on the other hand, that elderly person may end up living there in that same home alone. If their spouse dies and if their adult children have moved on, then they may find themselves alone in that home. One of the things that people then may do as they get older and they retire, they may increase their home improvement projects. They might spend more time interacting with their family. And that brings us then to the frail elderly. So this then is people who are age 65, who are physically infirm. They have some physical impairments, or very ill, or cognitively impaired. So can be any of those things. We'll look at, what we look at to make that determination in a minute. Most of the frail elderly are going to be amongst that oldest old category of people age 85 and up. So we determine who should be considered frail by first of all looking at the ADLs, activities of daily living for the late adulthood. These are actions that the person needs to do in order to live independently. Let's have a look at the list here. Okay. So those include what? Eating, being able to feed yourself. If you can't do that, well, somebody's going to have to come and help you. And dressing, you have to be able to dress yourself, obviously. Um, Bathing, one has to be able to keep one's body clean and so forth. Again, if you can't do that, somebody's going to have to help you. And then toileting, being able to go to the bathroom and clean up afterwards appropriately. You get the idea. Once again, if you're not able to do that, you're going to need assistance. And then I call this one mobility. Some people break this out differently, but kind of combining ambulation, being able to get around. Usually we think of walking, but that might be some other way to get around, and then transferring from one position to another. For example, being able to get up from a chair and move to a bed, vice versa, that sort of ability. And so, once again, if you are unable to do that, somebody's going to have to step in and help. So, the inability to do any of these really should be considered a sign of frailty. Someone is going to need to help. But in fact, insurance companies may not consider that person to be frail until they have as many as three or more deficits in this area. So what does that mean? Things that might help that person that insurance could maybe pay for might not be available until they get to be pretty bad off. And it kind of doesn't make sense if you think about it, because really not getting the assistance for that person when they first become frail is going to what? Only accelerate their decline if they're not getting the assistance they need. But do be aware that that occurs. Now, on the other hand, occupational therapy or special equipment may extend a person's ability to do those ADLs. So maybe the person has, lost the ability to dress themselves. They're getting arthritis in their fingers and they can't button their clothing, but some occupational therapy might help them to relieve some of that arthritis and continue to do that. Or special equipment. So, getting a walker when one is not able to walk without hanging on to something, or one of those scooters as if a person's legs become weak, might enable them to continue to be independent. We secondly need to also look at the IADLs, the instrumental activities of daily living as well. Once again, if a person is unable to perform these kind of tasks, they also are going to need assistance and should be considered frail. So, what are these? These are things that require not physical competency, but intellectual competency. So the ability to think clearly, to plan ahead, and so forth. So let's have a look at some of these. Now, it depends on the cultural setting as to what these might be. In some cultural groups in some parts of the world, that might be, remembering to feed animals and remembering how to bake bread or whatever. Those are tasks that require mental capability within that cultural setting. Here in our cultural setting, developed parts of the world, these would include things such as managing medications. So being able to remember to take one's medication, but not a double dose of it, being able to read on the medicine bottle what you're supposed to take and do it, so forth. Also would involve, yeah, obtaining necessities. So that might be, when one goes to the grocery store, can one remember what they need to get? Or do you get all one thing and then you get home and then there's nothing you can cook with it? So today that also might actually be taken care of by sometimes ordering things online and so on, but nonetheless, figuring out what you need, what you should get in order to take care of particular needs. Also managing finances, so being able to keep track of how much money you've got in your checking account, pay bills on time, yeah, comparing, and he has here comparing Medigap insurance plans. Yeah, although that challenges even some younger people, or completing income tax returns. Yeah, if they're not too complex, but even younger people are going to need an accountant if it's more complex, right? So you got to keep that in mind. Um, Using transportation, yeah. So if you're in an area, if you can't drive, you know, and there's public transportation, can you figure out, how to show up at the bus stop when the bus is actually going to come and which bus to get on and things like that. Um, okay. Getting back to driving, yeah, if the person is still able to drive, are you able to interpret the traffic signals and signs along the way? Do you still able to interpret who has the right of way and driving and so forth? And yeah, some people actually sort of lose those abilities. In other words, they can physically aim the car in the right direction. Yeah, they don't know what to do with the car. Yeah. Okay, using a telephone, for example, to call for help or pay a phone bill, so on. Maintaining a household. So, can one keep up with things that need to be fixed and have somebody do that if you can't do it yourself? Things like that. Meal preparation and nutrition. Now, here's a really big one because yeah, if one slips to where one's not able to do that, then you end up with potentially malnutrition, poorly balanced diet, some really serious things, dehydration. So that's a real important one. And notice, yeah, that's not just a matter of physically putting the food on the stove, but it's, yeah, realizing what you need to eat and so forth. So these are important, and notice that, in fact, these maybe are more critical to remaining self-sufficient than those ADLs, because yeah, if you can't do these, you're going to have some very significant problems very quickly. Now, inability then indicates frailty, even when the person is able to do those ADLs that we looked at earlier. So we have to take these instrumental activities of daily living very seriously. So we know that the prevalence of frailty has increased worldwide. And why do we have more frail elderly people? Well, for one thing, more people are simply reaching older age. And we have medical technology that can keep people alive, but in many cases, those people are developing chronic problems that result in inability to do basic tasks. So, our lack of success at relieving chronic health problems, things like arthritis, things like sensory deficits, and so on, mean that you've got people that are living longer, but they're having trouble doing these tasks. We also probably have not sufficiently stressed prevention. So, stressing how to live a healthy lifestyle is going to help prevent that. If people are eating right, keeping their body strong as much as possible, and getting sufficient sleep, they're going to age more in a more healthy way. Okay. Um, Maybe particularly prevention though, and helping elderly people remain active, because often that's where the problem comes in. And maybe there's some injury that the person experiences, or they're having pain somewhere, so they stop doing things. And then as they stop using that part of their body, the muscles weaken, the balance is lost, and they now are even less able. So if we can stress, let's find a way to keep you active, we can also tamp down on this. Another reason that we're seeing higher numbers of frail elderly people is that even where there are existing treatments, people may not be able to access them. If they're poor, they may not be able to afford some of the technologies that are available. If they're uninformed, they may not be aware that there are things that could help them. If they're isolated, they may not be able to access that. So when it comes to the care of the frail elderly, most often they will be cared for by families and friends. That might be an aging spouse, might be a son or daughter, In some cases, maybe even niece, nephew, things like that, or a friend. So, providing care for frail elderly people can produce stress, depression, resentment. It's not easy. It can be frustrating. And situations where it's particularly likely to produce these negative sorts of effects if one is caring for an elderly person and one feels that I'm doing more than my share. Other family members who should be helping aren't doing their share. That makes it that much more difficult to cope with the stresses of caring for that person. Also, where we have situations, the caregiver and elderly person don't agree on what care is to be given. So maybe the doctor has said that grandpa should be using that walker, and he says, hell no, I'm not doing it. And we have to keep telling him, no, you've got to do that. The doctor said so. And yeah, that makes it more stressful. Um, so, what we also know is that services to relieve caregivers of these elderly people often difficult to obtain. You know, getting someone to come in is difficult. It's expensive if you have to pay out of your pocket for someone to care for them. Um, Insurance companies often don't provide anything for this or very little. Can really wear that caregiver down. And I'll just give you a case in point. Um, my dad passed away many, many, many years ago. And so eventually my mom remarried. And after she did, her new husband eventually began developing serious health problems as they got older. He had diabetes, and the diabetes worsened. He also developed heart disease. He developed emphysema and some other respiratory problems. And he began developing neurocognitive disorder, dementia. And so it eventually came to the point where mom was spending all day, every day in the house, taking care of him, making sure that he took the medications at the right time, that he was eating properly for his diabetes, making sure that he wasn't going out to the barn to get on his tractor, which he was not really capable of driving safely anymore. Oh, you name it, all day long, managing medications and answering what day is it over and over again. And that got very difficult because even going out to get groceries, really a problem because, well, you couldn't leave him sit in the car. You couldn't leave him at home, definitely. Oh, and by the way, his sons and daughters were just not willing to come and pitch in. So mom kind of had it all on herself. But at any rate, yeah, going to the grocery store, you couldn't leave him in the car because, well, you didn't know if he might get up and wander off, get lost. If you tried to bring him in the store, well, he couldn't walk very far or very fast. You really couldn't get a lot done. Um, this was, I guess, before they had those scooters. I think they might have had them, but he might have refused to ride on one of those things. It just was very difficult. And so, uh, you know, my mom even said, she'd been a nurse for many years, but taking care of patients that you saw for a while and then went on your way was a lot different than being cooped up 24/7 with one, basically what it amounted to. At any rate, so she started checking around, trying to find whether she might be able to have somebody come in and somebody might help pay for it. She didn't really have a lot of spare money. And so insurance company really didn't provide anything. Um, she then got the idea to check with the VA. He was a veteran and see whether maybe something was available there. And sure enough, they did have something available, although it was just someone to come in for a few hours once a month. That's not a lot. Yeah. So even there, wow. Um, so you can see the difficulties. And So notice that one of the important things that we need to provide for people who are caring for the frail elderly is respite care. Somebody to come in for a few hours or a weekend or a day to spell them, to give them a little bit of relief so that they can sort of recuperate from some of those stresses. That's one of the things we need to push for, maybe even in our legislation, that there are these sort of things available. And this ties directly into also elder neglect and abuse, because, yeah, if it becomes too much for that caregiver, that's where we run the greater risk of elder abuse or neglect. Okay, so and then looking at the topic of elder abuse, I think when we think of this sort of thing, you usually think of maybe that happening in a nursing home or something like that. But the sad situation is more commonly this happens in the home. And more commonly than not, it's a family member that is involved with that abuse. It's especially common a middle-aged adult, child of that elderly person who is supposed to be caring for them, being the one who snaps and abuses. So sometimes that abuse is not mm, right from the onset, but it may be progressive. That caregiver first might engage in financial abuse, and so I say, well, mom, I know you really aren't able to keep up with your finances anymore. So, I'll take care of getting your bills paid. I'll take care of your checkbook for you. And then the person eventually says, hey, you know what? I've been putting a lot of time in here. I think I'm entitled to, write myself a few checks there. I don't think I need to say anything to them. Well, that's kind of financial abuse, right? There's also the potential that this also progresses into neglect, as that caregiver family member might begin to fatigue and simply neglect to do the things that that person needs, or may progress into direct aggression as well as stresses mount. So it's not always all right at first. It may build over time. Now, there are a few factors then that we know do increase the likelihood of elder abuse, and some characteristics of the person who ends up being an abuser um, often, well, I should say often, but it's more likely that they become abusive if they have emotional problems, if they've got a substance abuse problem, or if they become fatigued and if they are highly stressed by that and other things. Okay, so it's not necessarily that they're born being an abuser, but in fact, as these things mount, they may end up abusing. Now, in terms of characteristic of the victim, and I want to be real clear on something here, we're not blaming the victim of elder abuse for that abuse, not at all. But there are certain things that makes them more likely to be subject to it. And the first thing is, yeah, just frailty. And the more frail they are, the more difficult they are to care for, placing more stress on the caregiver. Also, if they are isolated, okay, because if they are being maltreated, they may have no one that they can turn to if they're isolated. Also, if they're more difficult to care for, if they're combative, and so on, and if they're cognitively impaired, because dealing with that is, again, more difficult. Okay, so again, we're not blaming the victim for that, but if these things exist, there is a greater potential for abuse there. And then we also see it occurring more readily in situations of poverty, simply the stresses of dealing with poverty. Along with it may come a lack of education on the part of either the caregiver or the victim. May not be even fully aware of what that elderly person really needs, or how to best take care of them. And then where there's a dependence between the victim and abuser. So if the victim is completely dependent on that caregiver, they may tolerate neglect or abuse, thinking to themselves, well, at least they're somewhat taking care of me. If I say anything about it, well, then who's going to take care of me? Then nobody, they might feel, which is sad, but maybe how they think. So when we look at this, what can we do to prevent elder abuse? One of the things would be, as we mentioned, that caregivers do have opportunity for some respite care to get a break for some of the stress, whether that is through other family members pitching in, whether that's making paid caregivers available to that person and so forth. Again, may require some changes in how we do things as a country. Um, Also, yes, educating people about how best to take care of that older person as well. And then all of those things that go along with if we should have any suspicion of abuse. So, if abuse is suspected here in Texas, all of us are required by the law to report that suspicion of abuse. Now, of course, if that abuse is happening right this moment, well, then the way to report it is dial 911 if it's happening right this moment. That said, if it's not going on at this exact moment, then one might report it through local police department, or one might also report that abuse to the Council on Aging, local chapter. There is the Texas Abuse Hotline, in which you can report any suspicion of abuse at any age group. One just has to Google Texas Abuse Hotline. How hard would that be, right? And there will come up a phone number where one can call and report that, or one can report it in writing as well, and can report it either with their name attached to the report or anonymously. So there's no excuse for not reporting this. And if it is reported, then there will be follow up to investigate and mm, um, verify if abuse is occurring. And then if they do find abuse, then they're going to take steps that the person be placed in a better situation, or that there be some change in circumstances. So if you suspect any of this, report it. Okay, so in terms of, again, caring for the frail elderly and long-term care, again, this may occur at home with assistance from family members and or home health aides. Um, Here in our part of the country, in the Rio Grande Valley, that's going to be probably the preferred way to do things. I think in our culture here, it's thought of as best for people to be at home with family. And that's really kind of a good thing, because that's probably, under the right circumstances, the most effective, most humane for the person. Now, that said, there's also the potential that person chooses assisted living. Now, that's only for some elderly people. Okay. So, assisted living is really only practical for the person that is able to do their ADLs. They're not frail. They can pretty much take care of themselves. So assisted living is sort of like they have sort of like apartments that the person buys or leases, and that assisted living facility, then they have some privacy, they have their own place, they have some independence, they can kind of do what they want there. There may be some medical supervision available for them. Some of those facilities will have a nurse that comes around and visits the residents on a regular basis, just to see whether they have any medical needs, and makes referrals usually, checks to see, are you up on your medication, maybe provides blood pressure checks if the person wants it, things like that. Those assisted living facilities also might provide some other services for their residents. They might provide transportation to the grocery stores and doctor visits. They might provide maybe some activities that the people can do in a common area of that assisted living facility. So that gives that older person that's in fairly good shape a chance to be independent, interact with others, have some privacy, but not have to, say, take care of a home and a yard, that sort of thing. Uh, Now, there is also potentially nursing home care for elderly, the frail elderly as well. So this is more for, yes, the elderly that are frail, that have some significant health problems, or they have some significant cognitive problems. So in a nursing home, there is going to be nurses and aides on site 24/7 to take care of medical needs that the person has. They also provide more assistance for that person, more services, so helping the person eat, bathe if necessary, help them dress themselves, all those kinds of things that the person needs. Now, we should say that the quality of care that is provided in nursing homes varies greatly. You have some nursing homes well run and just excellent care. You have other nursing homes that, in fact, may be the very opposite of that spectrum and really not very good care. And here's the sad fact that whereas there are state requirements, regulations for nursing homes in terms of care, there are numerous nursing homes that repeatedly, when inspected, fail those inspections. Violations of many of those regulations may be observed, and in many cases, they are not corrected. Sometimes the nursing home actually finds it to be cheaper to go ahead and pay the fines for the violations than it is to fix them. Okay, so be aware of that. The care does vary a lot. Now, most of them is pretty good, but there are some that not so good. So, um, how does one determine what level of care is going to be encountered at a particular nursing home? Well, there's a few things you can look at, and one of the things would be just to look at, how have they been doing on state inspections? I don't have it on the outline. That's something you probably want to look at. If there's a lot of violations and they're not correcting them, you might want to look elsewhere. You're also going to look at other things like, what kind of staff. So what is the ratio of nursing staff to the number of residents as compared to other places? And what qualifications do they require for that staff? How much experience does the staff have? Is the staff stable? In other words, do the same people continue working there, or is it kind of like a revolving door where the employees are just coming and going and you never know who's going to be there, and you go back there in a few weeks and none of the people that were working there are anymore there, that sort of thing. Also the attitude of staff there, and that takes often frequent observation and spending some time there to get a handle on that. Also, they find that better nursing homes will encourage as much independence as possible of the resident. So if that person can walk, they're going to encourage them to walk as much as they can. They're not going to discourage them from doing things that they can do themselves. Okay, so that'd be one thing that you would look for. Also, privacy and respecting their need for self-respect. So does the person have a place where they can keep their own things? do they have a place, even if they share a room with someone, where they can be in private? Um, does the staff, when changing their clothes, do they again take some care for the person's modesty, um, and that sort of thing? That's another thing to look at. So again, it may take some repeated observation. What other thing I just kind of learned in, yeah, talking about that situation where my mom had, eventually she had to put Bill in a nursing home because it got to be where literally it was too difficult for her to take care of him. Okay, and she struggled with that a lot, and her husband's sons and daughters were divided as to whether it ought to be done and so forth. But eventually, yeah, they put him in the nursing home. So the times that I visited and went along with mom to see him in the nursing home there, I learned a few things. And one of them was that if you want to really see how that nursing home operates, go there on a Sunday afternoon, even Sunday afternoon towards dinner time. And why then? Because I found out, well, that's the time when they're most likely to have to be short on staff, when people called in and said, I can't make it today, and so forth. And do they have the backup to take care of things even under those circumstances? And so that can be very revealing. But yeah, evaluating those situations takes a lot of effort. Okay, we should again reiterate there are many nursing homes that provide excellent care for residents, and if one can find one of those and access that for the elderly family member if needed, that is actually very good. Okay, so that brings us to the end of that chapter. And so we're going to stop there and hope you found something useful in here or something that you may use eventually. And we'll hope to be seeing you eventually as well.